Hello, and welcome to my video overview on the neuroscience behind effective motor learning. I'm Sarah Lewis. I've been fighting SCA rapier for over 20 years and HEMA for over 3. My PhD is in neuroscience, and my research focuses on movement disorders. In this video, we're going to examine reasons why you should be rethinking how we approach both teaching as well as learning. We're going to examine how learning works from a science perspective, but I'm going to start by giving away the big secret. And that's humans learn best from purposeful practice, which is defined by these 3 features. The first is get outside your comfort zone. The second is practice in a focused way, with clear goals, a plan to meet your goals, a way to monitor your progress. The third is maintain your motivation. So everything else I discuss here is just the details behind these 3 core principles. The book Peak, The Secrets from the New Science of Expertise, summarizes the findings of decades of performance science. So performance science studies everything from the early acquisition of skills in infants to top competitive athletes. And it looks at how we push both individual as well as collective potential. You can read more about many of these ideas there. But the idea I want to start with is the idea that training produces brain changes. We're pretty familiar with the idea that training is going to change your muscles, your lungs, but we're less familiar with the idea that you're going to produce changes in your brain. And it turns out the changes that really matter for skill are going to be in your brain. For instance, when you look at cortical thickness, which is a measure of the amount of brain dedicated to doing a particular task of competitive divers versus non-divers, you see a great expansion in the areas that are responsible for both visualizing and executing complex movements. So this shows us that in order to, as we practice, our brain changes. And to learn, we have to get our brain on board, and our brain is lazy. It only pays attention to what you make it pay attention to, and we have to create a challenge in order to create change. So here we're going to focus on motor learning. You activate neurons, and that ultimately drives the contraction of specific muscles. If you want to do a very specific task, you need to recruit the exact correct muscles in the exact correct order. So when you start learning, you start with many neutral associations. And through trial and error, as well as feedback, you strengthen connections you want to keep and weaken connections that you do not. So motor learning is the process of optimizing the system by evaluating and keeping what works and discarding what doesn't. And this involves 3 phases: the cognitive phase, the associative phase, and the automatic phase. In the cognitive phase, you require a conscious decision of what it is that you're going to do, your actions that you will take. This is mentally involved because you have to find appropriate strategies to reach the desired goal. So in this time, instructors should be breaking down the lesson into single, small components and dedicating time for the person to practice it, and help the students think through the steps that are going to be required. Lessons should be short in this case, rather than trying to lay the foundation all at once. And I'll discuss more about that when I get to memory interference. An instructor should be able to model successful strategies and provide feedback to help the student achieve them. Good strategies are going to be retained in this period of time, and inefficient strategies are going to be discarded. And what this looks like is huge gains in a very short period of time. This also looks like a series of failures, and so the instructor is responsible for helping the student understand the context. If you are in the process of identifying and discarding unwanted strategies, you are going to have things that don't work. And motor learning is about learning what does work just as much as it is learning what doesn't work and discarding it. So help your students manage those expectations. The second phase of motor learning is the associative phase. This is defined by subtle adjustments in performance. This is where the student will string together several motor tasks, either in series or in parallel. Students are going to benefit from seeing how to incorporate techniques. So this is going to be where you describe how you step with a shot in order to increase your power, or incorporating a head or a body void along with a block in order to be more effective. As the student is getting the kinks out, they're going to be eliminating non-optimized sequences or actions, and they're going to be ready to try new things. This is a good time to try varying applications to actually fit the student's particular biomechanics. And this is going to require a lot of repetition. The other thing that you need to know about this phase is that relearning is even more frustrating than learning it correctly in the first place. So there's a neuroscience explanation to this. Neuroplasticity is about strengthening connections you wish to keep and weakening connections that you don't want to use. And so if you have strengthened inappropriately and weakened inappropriately, in order to learn the new task that you want to do, you have to first go back to baseline and then recruit your learning. So you can think about it as a sandbox, and you want to direct water flow to a particular point from A to B. Okay? As part of this, you're going to dig channels, that is strengthening your connections. And the more passes you go over it, the deeper and the narrower you can make your channels, and the more direct. At the same time, you're also building mounds for areas you don't want the water flow to go. So you start with a neutral associations, and then you build associations in order to direct the water flow. But if you discover that you've directed the water to the wrong point, or you've gone in a circumventus way, you need to fill in those channels. You need to flatten those mounds before you can begin to dig your new channels and build your mounds. So ideally, you should have good instructor support for new people so that they have a chance to not develop bad habits. Okay. The other thing to know about the associative phase is that improvements are going to be much more gradual because your movements are becoming more consistent. You're honing it in, you're getting closer and closer. But this can take a long time. This can take months or years. And compared to the really quick gains of the cognitive phase, this can feel like you're getting stuck. We call this hitting a plateau. And you'll also be experiencing setbacks as you go through relearning to find exactly what it is that works for you and with the other things that you're learning. And so the instructor is going to be pivotal to keeping the student motivated through this period of time. The third phase is the automatic phase, and this is where you're automatically completing tasks without it requiring conscious attention. The action is faster than thought. You're able to respond on cue, in flow. The brain is free for calculation. This is where you can be thinking about evaluating your opponent, making decision trees, and you're not having to think about the actions. You already have your toolbox of responses, and you're just going to execute that program. This is where you want to be in competition, but this is not where you want to be to learn. The brain does not actually make changes when it's in this phase. And so in order to further optimize, in order to build new skills, you have to revisit the cognitive phase and the associative phase. And we call this going back to basics, or get out of your comfort zone. So what is the motor learning process and how does it work? Motor learning is a type of stimulus response learning. So this is where you make a association between some environmental stimulus and a response. And when it's paired with a favorable outcome, this is going to be strengthened. When your stimulus and response is followed by an undesired outcome, it is weakened. So an example might be a descending cut. If you see it coming, that's your stimulus. You provide your block, that's your response. If you get the block just right and you stay safe, that is a desired outcome. If you put it out too far and your hands are exposed, or you drop your tip and the sword slides off and you're struck, that is not a desired outcome. And so you're learning how to get to precisely the right location without those little permutations that can result in an undesired outcome. So it's important that students understand what the stimulus is, what their response is, and whether the outcome was good or bad in order to form the correct associations. So this can be a problem if foundational knowledge is poor, if the stimulus is varied during training, so they're not able to connect that response to that particular stimulus. It can also be a problem if you go too fast. There's not enough time to recognize the stimulus before you need to do the response. There needs to be that sequence of events. It can also be a problem if there's not a clear communication, or the stimulus is set up in such a way that is going to be different from what they see in a fight. For instance, falling short in your measure. So this leads to part 2 of purposeful practice, and that's monitoring your progress and understanding the outcome. And for that, there's 2 types of feedback I'm going to talk about. The first is inherent feedback, and the second is augmented feedback. So inherent feedback is internal feedback. These are your senses. This is you seeing your shot land. This is you feeling being struck. This is also proprioception, being able to sense muscle stretch, joint angle, balance, where your body is in space. Augmented feedback is external. This can be provided by video, an instructor, or some other source. Instructor augmented feedback is going to be critical for a lot of body mechanic issues. Correcting, tucking the elbow in so that it's safe, that you're stepping in the correct direction. So this is a good way of helping the student learn what correct placement should feel like. And for this process, there's 2 types of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement and there's negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement just refers to identifying the correct response and outcome and strengthening those connections. So the correct outcome produces a brain chemical called a neuromodulator. This can be dopamine, this can be serotonin. Okay? So you have the correct outcome creating your neuromodulator. The stimulus response is electrically activating certain synapses. And when you have that electrical activity in the presence of that neuromodulator, that is when the synapse is physically changed to become stronger over time. So if you don't have in the same time window that electrical activation with the neuromodulator, you will not strengthen those connections. Okay? So it is very important that you have multiple successes in the same time period. You're going to need repetition, and you're going to need immediate feedback so that they understand that they had the correct outcome. There's plenty of ways to do immediate feedback, verbal. Another thing to look into might be clicker or tag training. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when a student is first learning, they're going to get it right. And then you're going to see more variable outcomes. And that means that when you are training, you need to provide enough time for them to get it right, get it wrong in ways that are kind of close to getting it right, and then come back to the correct outcome and being able to produce that with consistency. In order to make the long-term changes that you need, you have to actually repeat the correct sequence multiple times. Once is not enough. Stop and work it through. And the other thing that's really important, I feel, is that when the student puts it all together, you really need to stop and emphasize it, point it out, celebrate the success. So what this does is it provides a huge boost to global neuromodulators, and this is going to help with memory consolidation. And I'll tell you more about that later. So, negative reinforcement is the process of identifying the incorrect outcome and selectively weakening the connections leading to that response. And so what I will say is that the brain is very good at this. It's called error detection. And most students will notice when they've made a mistake. So while I advocate being very quick with positive feedback, it's best actually to wait a moment and see whether the student self-corrects before jumping in with augmented negative feedback. The other thing you need to know is that the brain can't implement a negative. Thinking very hard about not doing something activates the same circuits as actually performing the task. And that's why the directive, "don't touch your face," is so difficult to maintain. So when you give negative reinforcement, you also need to provide redirection. That's not what you want to be doing. Here, try this instead. And remember, you might need to physically move the student a little bit, always with the student's consent. The final thing I will say about negative reinforcement is that humiliation is not a training tool. If you're making every setback and failure feel insurmountable, you're not facilitating student learning. They're more likely to quit than feel motivated to learn from those mistakes. So, motor skill consolidation, it represents the process by which a learned skill is put into long-term memory over the process of several hours. This is facilitated by consolidation tools, which look like debriefing after the exercise. So this is where you discuss what the student learned, and it's useful to use different modalities that work best for the student to help them with this. It might be having them write down in a notebook that they keep, what they learned this week. It might be going back to the manual and showing them a picture of what they learned. It might be having a question and answer period and discussing with the student, what they learned, how they plan to apply it. It depends on your student, so there's different ways to do this, but make sure that you're checking in with your student afterwards to help them think actively about what they learned and how they're going to use it. The other thing that really helps with consolidation is feeling good about your performance. As it turns out, a depressed state will actually lead to worse outcomes. So support, giving those reinforcements, making the student feel good about their performance is part of the instructor's job if they want them to actually learn and retain that material. So interference is when a competing memory is being consolidated at the same time as your desired memory. So learning multiple competing skills in the same session is going to lead to worse outcomes. Neither skill is going to be learned as well as if you had just focused on a single skill. So ideally you want to keep training sessions short and focused. And if you do have a longer training session, that you're utilizing that time to do things that are integrated or build on one another. So drills that teach a similar concept from different angles, or doing drilling early and then using it in a sparring context later in the training session. So the other thing that memory interference tells us is that you want to spend your time working with a single teacher if possible. So teachers who have multiple competing ideas in the same time period are going to sort of contradict each other and lead to worse outcomes for the students. So for students, make sure that you're dedicating time to really work with an instructor instead of bouncing from one to another. And instructors, make sure that you are giving other instructors the chance to do their jobs and not jumping in and stepping all over their toes. So to recap, purposeful practice. You want to get outside of your comfort zone. You want to have clear goals, a plan to reach your goals, and a way to monitor your progress. And finally, you need to stay focused and motivated. And we typically think of focus and motivation as being student responsibilities, but I'd argue that the instructor plays a key role as well. And so the instructor should be establishing expectations to have the student take responsibility for their focus and motivation. The instructor should probably talk about their goals, ask the student about theirs, encourage them to come to practice, make sure they're provided with resources for outside of practice. Create an environment that doesn't sabotage focus and motivation. So the book Fear is the Mind Killer does a great job of talking about both the benefits as well as how to set up this type of environment. But briefly, some of the benefits are that you'll have good student attendance and retention. You'll have students stepping into instructor roles over time. You'll have time to socialize, you'll have time to learn separately, and you'll have students and instructors from all sorts of different backgrounds who feel challenged, safe, and welcomed. The next really key thing that the instructor can do for student motivation is communicating clearly and providing valuable and meaningful information. So know your stuff. Travel to learn with the best instructors. Read with the goal of being able to provide that information to your students. Understand different ways of presenting. Read up on different modalities of learning. Be organized and work out your plan in advance. Write a lesson plan. Talk it over with somebody else to make sure it makes sense. Practice it on a smaller group of people before you take it to a larger venue. And use your students' experiences to actually adapt and optimize your lesson plan. Make sure you're not providing too many competing ideas that are leading to interference. Make sure you're providing enough time to allow for ample drilling. So, and finally, communicate clearly. Demonstrate what it is that you need the student to do. Use feedback that works. So, know the modalities that your students are responding to and try to utilize those. And if you tend to be a very direct person, make sure that that's what the student wants and is going to respond best to before you jump in every time like that. And finally, the instructor will help keep the student focused and motivated by being challenged without being overwhelmed. And this raises the question of where should teachers set the bar? And all the best science shows that you learn best right at that boundary between success and failure. Think about it. If you're constantly fighting people who are just a little bit better than you, you're going to keep improving. However, if you're only sparring people who are at a lower level than you or way above your skill level who don't bring it down, you're never going to improve. And so Locke and Lothrop talked about this, and they said that as long as the student has clear goals and don't have conflicting goals and have the requisite ability to obtain it, that there's a positive linear relationship between goal difficulty and task performance. And so a good instructor is going to set a task at a difficulty where there's going to be mixed success and failure when it's first attempted. And then the instructor is going to guide the student through the process with feedback until the student reliably hits success, the correct responses, the desired outcomes. And at that point, then the teacher is going to set the bar a little bit higher, move the student on to the next task at the next level of difficulty. And so goals are important for directing attention, action, and effort. And as it turns out, attention, action, and effort is exactly what teachers require from their students for mutual success. So in summary, learning requires changes to the brain, and this is most effective through purposeful practice. And I would argue that what instructors do is help guide students through these three components of purposeful practice. Number one, help get students out of their comfort zones, break them out of their slumps and their plateaus by bringing them back to the cognitive phase and guiding them through the associative phase. Number two, help your students with their goals. Provide them clear feedback about how they're doing. Help them build a plan. And help the students set challenging goals to push the limits of their abilities. And finally, help direct student focus and motivation by providing meaningful content, a supportive training environment, and helping to direct their focus. Thanks for watching.